weather down here in West Sussex has been absolutely shocking today. We've had hail, we've had thunder, we've had rain, and what a good evening just to sit down and talk about something really important for the future of our planet. In what we try to do with these little seminars is pick a subject, bring a few experts and enthusiasts and tease it out and try and understand it better. And if we raise some issues of controversy, that's great. If we don't, great. What we want to do is to leave you with lots of ideas and having had the ability to chat and participate later on. So why us? Why does Curlew Action dare to do this? Well, I think the curlew is a wading bird, but the curlew is an indicator species, and it's what is good for the curlew is good for the ground nesting birds, and what happens to the ground nesting birds speaks for the health of the grasslands. And what we do with our grasslands comments on our stewardship of the countryside, and what the stewardship of our countryside tells us how well we look after nature. And it always occurs to me that, you know, we're terribly important, we humans, but if the Earth's history was a 24-hour clock, our written history would be the last 10th of a second. That's how important we actually are on the Earth. And Mary will laugh when I say this because everyone uses the John Muir quote. But one of the reasons what we firmly believe in Curlew Action is everything is connected to everything else. And the John Muir quote is, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything in the universe. So that's why we at Curlew Action do this kind of thing. We live in a world where climate change has got the microphone, and we understand why climate change has got the microphone. But there are a number of other issues, really pressing issues, like water quality, water quantity, soil degradation, air pollution, plastic, and species loss, biodiversity loss, which are just as important and which don't get the airtime they need. So in a way, this is part of our contribution to doing that. There's a big Venn diagram in that what is good for one tends to be good for the others, not exclusively, and maybe we'll have a look at that this evening. But I've heard more people say that biodiversity loss is more likely to kill us than climate change than the other way around. And I think we should stick to that for this evening. Finally, who am I? I'm Roger Morgan Grenville. I'm the Chair of Trustees for Curlew Action, purely because I failed to turn up to the initial meeting before everyone else and was voted as the Chair of Trustees. I write on conservation and biodiversity, and I did a 1,000-mile walk earlier this year from Lymington up to Cape Wrath, really to see for myself at the age of 62 what is going on. And I came up with 3 thoughts. One is that no one talks about biodiversity and nature enough. The second one is, if I thought the situation was bad, the situation for biodiversity is actually much, much worse than I thought. But on a note of optimism, it is also much easier to do something about it than, say, for climate change. And some of the things that we can do are devastatingly easy. So we have a stellar panel for you this evening. And first of all, Alex Antonelli, Professor Antonelli, who really is a world-leading expert on this. And we're very, very lucky that he's come to our thing this evening. He's the Director of Science at Kew, and he's a Professor of Biodiversity and Systematics at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And he writes, his passion is nature, and his mission is to stop biodiversity loss. I think that really says everything we need to. He wrote this lovely book, which when I was trying to learn about the subject myself, I found a very, very good primer in just understanding the basis of biodiversity, why it's got a problem and what we can do about it. So welcome, Alex. Then secondly, we have Dr. Sean McCormack, who is a proud Irishman, and he's qualified as a vet in 2010, and he's taken every opportunity since then to get stuck into conservation, particularly on a local level in his sort of adopted homeland of Ealing. And his latest thing is he's got an application in to have London's first beavers, I think, Sean.
First urban beaver trial, yeah.
First urban beavers. He is a huge enthusiast and a huge communicator, and you may, like me, have seen him on YouTube or on Instagram. He's been on Autumn Watch, he's been on the Now Show, but what he does is he communicates the importance of nature and biodiversity, and there aren't enough people who do that. So, and if you want to have a look at him at his best, go on YouTube and look at him talking about edible dormice, and we might ask him later whether the dormice are actually edible. And then finally, we're lucky to have Joe Wilkins, who is a proud Welshman. Joe describes himself as an environmentalist and ocean lover with a background in ecosystem ecology and a passion to achieve greater youth involvement in conservation and environmental governance. Strip that down to its basic parts. We desperately need people like Joe, because we desperately need the youth, not just to be engaged on a volunteer level or an enthusiast level, but actually getting stuck into the governance. And so he's come in to look at that angle, and I think in so doing is becoming the youngest panelists we've got. So what's going to happen is Alex is going to talk for 5 minutes, then Sean, then Joe. The rough thread is what we want to do is talk about what biodiversity is, why we need it, what's gone wrong, how we can fix it, what happened at COP, and how we can hold people's feet to the fire to make sure the commitments that were reached there mean something. So without further ado, Alex, can I mute myself and ask you to talk a little bit?
Sure. So thanks so much, Roger, and thanks so much, everyone, for joining today. I'll share my screen now, and I hope you can see here. And the title is exactly what Roger said. I just want to talk a few words about what biodiversity is, why it matters, and how we ended up in this mess, and then a little bit forward-looking as well, trying to be a bit more positive. But as Roger said, I did try to explain the concept of biodiversity, which in my view is really not a single component, but several. And you can compare that to a star, as you can see here, where biodiversity is composed of 5 different angles or vertices here, where one of them is the species, and that's what most people talk about. But then the genetic diversity is, of course, extremely important in the face of climate change and the resilience of species to exist into the future. But then the evolutionary aspect is something that a lot of people don't think about, which is the position they represent in the tree of life, and losing some of those major branches could have a significant impact in our ability to understand life on Earth, but also to cope with climate change. And then the functions that each species play in an ecosystem, you have herbivores, you have carnivorous animals, we have plants that are either very big, like trees or herbs, and all those have different functions, and that's very important to think about and protect as well. And finally, the ecosystems themselves. So that's the combination of different species, and that's why we have so many species on this planet. When it comes to biodiversity and why it matters, I think there are 2 main components here. One of them is really the own intrinsic value of biodiversity. I think we think a lot about what we can get out of it, but of course species have a value on their own, and which right do we have to drive them into extinction? They've been here for millions of years before humans, so it's really important. As Roger said, just a few milliseconds where humans entered this stage. But the contributions of nature to us are immense, and this is just a short list of those. So of course, everything we eat, most of the medicines we have, about 50 to 80%. We use species for shelter, a source of fiber, clothing, beauty material. They give us enormous services in terms of pollination of all the nuts we eat, for instance. They're very important for nutrient cycling, soil fertility, climate regulation. They help us against pollution in the cities. They prevent flooding. They help against new diseases. They prevent erosion and making soils much less nutritious than they were in the past. And of course, very important for us in our well-being as well in terms of recreation and tourism. But the problem is that we've become very too dependent on very few species. So there are more than 7,000 plant species that are edible and are eaten locally, but actually over 40% of all the calories come from only 3 species, which is rice, maize, and wheat. And that makes us really vulnerable in the face of climate change. And when we talk about biodiversity, we also have to realize that perhaps here in the UK, you can always go to Tesco and buy most of the stuff you need. But of course, for billions of people around the world, it can be a matter of life or death, because that's the only resource that people have. It's the only asset, for instance, in Madagascar, where there are 28 million people, most of them facing extreme poverty, and nature is really one of the only rescues they have. So no matter how we measure biodiversity, any of those 5 components that I just showed you, I think it's very clear that the story is the same, that now 1 million species are estimated by our scientists to be at risk of extinction. And we are seeing report after report showing exactly the same picture. And that's exactly what Roger, I think, experienced in his long walk across the UK, that things are really, really bad. When it comes to plants, for instance, we're seeing that 2 in 5 are now estimated to be threatened to extinction. And you have to think that it is more than 350,000 species. So, it's a really difficult situation now. Over the next decades, we could be losing a major chunk of the biodiversity on this planet. And we've seen with the curlew some really drastic change in just 20 years. And I really like reading that information on the web page, Roger. So what's driving this? It's first of all the direct change in the environment. I'm showing a picture here from Borneo, but of course, if you're interested in the sea, we have trawling, we have fishery, and it's really diminishing the habitat of those species. And then we have these lovely colors here, which unfortunately are a representation of climate change over time, which really is putting a huge amount of pressure on species as well. So each color here represents an average temperature every year. And you see towards the right-hand side here that it's been getting really, really hot, of course. And my final slide is just about what Roger briefly mentioned. I hope that all of you are aware of COP15, which was the Conference of the Parties, or the United Nations Biodiversity Summit, which took place in December. I was pleased to be part of it. So I was there participating in some of the negotiations and providing advice to policymakers and politicians. And we now have a new global biodiversity framework up to 2050, so the next 30 years almost, and a milestone by 2030, which is fantastic. We were not sure we were actually getting a framework, but there are some issues as well. And one of them is, where is the money? And I think a lot of developing countries are really upset that there's no clarity about where the money is coming from and how much is it going to be enough. We also have to translate words to action. How are we going to implement this? For instance, protecting 30% of the world's surface by 30 and the oceans as well. How is this going to be done? And then how do we avoid previous failures? So we did have a biodiversity framework up to 2020, and we didn't meet a single one of those targets. So we have to do it differently. I'll stop here. Look forward to the discussion.
That's a really, really good summary, Alex. Thank you. And I just sort of say again that you really have been listening for the last 7 minutes to a world expert on this. So come up with lots of questions, everything else. So Sean, I imagine you're sitting in Ealing, thinking about your beavers. Tell us, have your presentation there.
Thanks. Yeah, Alan. So if you just want to pop on the slides, that'd be great. So I'm Sean McCormick. I'm a vet, but long before I ever had ambitions of being a vet, I was an absolute nature enthusiast from the get-go. Familiar story to many people in the audience, I'm sure, with an interest in nature and wildlife and biodiversity. I guess the question, of why biodiversity is important, if you want to go on to the next slide. As a vet, I guess we get some quite holistic training on not only animal health, but how animal health interacts with human health, and how both of those things are really, really influenced by healthy ecosystems as well. So this concept in the medical profession is called One Health, and not to blow the veterinary trumpet too strongly, I think vets really have adopted this kind of concept of One Health very, very more enthusiastically, I suppose, than even the human medical profession. And One Health concept is basically that we can't have healthy humans without healthy ecosystems. We can't have healthy ecosystems without healthy animals. and healthy humans. It's all interlinked, basically, like Alex was saying, similar to his kind of star model. That if we start to take little pieces of that Jenga puzzle out, the whole thing collapses. And what we're seeing in our very short lifespans is this, shifting baseline of massive, rapid biodiversity loss that we're not really able to measure very well, that a lot of people who aren't very interested in it aren't recognizing. We have short memories, we have short lifetimes, and we have short memories, and we're starting to really degrade those ecosystems. We're starting to lose some of the animals and plants within those ecosystems, and gradually, exacerbated by climate change, the whole ecosystems start to unravel. And those ecosystems are vital for our survival and success on this planet. We can't survive without them. So the services those ecosystems provide that Alex talked about will actually start to unravel. We're already seeing them unravel. So I would like to see the kind of One Health concept adopted more by the human medical profession, and also by economists and governments, because it is all interlinked. Roger talked about, the kind of biodiversity crisis being what I would say is the poor cousin of the climate crisis. And actually, they're completely interlinked. We should be talking about them, completely on equal terms, and really making a lot of noise about the biodiversity crisis in terms of political circles and powers that be. So if we just move on to the next slide, that'd be great. The next one is about, how we've messed it up so badly. And in one slide, how would I have a think the other night about how I would illustrate this? And I kind of created my own word cloud of the kind of words that I would summarize why the biodiversity crisis is there. And you can see, there's things like power, and there's things like governments, and there's the greed and money aspect to this. There's GDP and growth at all costs. There's kind of short-term thinking and short-term power cycles as well in governments that are lasting 5 and 10 years. Really, it's hard to make progress and really change kind of policies that will have an impact in those short-term cycles. But one of the things that really kind of got to me as one of the major factors, I think, is, I hate to use the word ignorance. It does come up a lot. I don't mean, willful ignorance or really negative ignorance, or to mean stupidity or anything like that, but just a lot of the population and society at the moment aren't really connected anymore to nature. So there is this disconnect, unfortunately, and that's been happening very rapidly. We've become a generation that is really detached from the land and where our food comes from and how we are part of the ecosystem. We're part of nature. We've really taken ourselves out of that cycle, the natural cycle of things, in a very, very short period of time. And unfortunately, I hate to use the word kids nowadays because it sounds really old, but kids that I talk to in our outreach with Eating Wildlife Group just don't know what a badger is or what a blackberry is. And that level of disconnect I find really shocking. So we need to do something to turn that around. And it's about really holding, I think, government and power to account. And not looking at our economic model of growth, improvement, GDP at all costs, really looking more holistically at that One Health model in economic terms as well. And this book by Kate Raworth, The Model of Donut Economics, if you haven't heard of it, look it up. It is absolutely fascinating and really, I believe, a model for the future. So we pop on to the next slide quickly if we can. The issue of COP15, I'm going to controversially make a confession, I guess, at this point in time. Been asked on to talk about biodiversity and what's the impact of COP15. And I'm going to confess that I don't know, because I checked out of COP15. In 2021, in November, myself and 5 other guys, another vet and an environmentalist and a film crew, sailed 1,000 miles from Cornwall to the Hebrides to try and bring the message of ocean biodiversity to COP26, because ocean health wasn't even on the agenda at COP26 in Glasgow, shocking as it is. And we recorded with hydrophones various underwater sounds and made a music track, released it on Spotify, and we managed to get it played into the blue halls to the powers that be at COP26. And to be honest with you, I came away from that month on a boat with 5 guys, having never sailed before, really, really jaded, not only with the cabin fever and the issues that entails, but with the kind of lack of action that seemed to have come from COP26. So this time around, in terms of avoiding burnout and emotional fatigue and not exacerbating the eco-anxiety I already have, I made a deliberate kind of decision not to couldn't engage too much with COP15. And what I've done on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about before we wrap up, is I've really brought my kind of energy and enthusiasm to what can I do as an individual on a local level? Because I find actually we're fed this kind of doom parade, I call it, where we're constantly hearing about declines and exacerbation of our problems and all the bad news all the time. But I wanted to create some good news and to engage our local community with what can be done and what is biodiversity on our doorstep, and really do that, cliched phrase now of thinking global, act local, but bring that to Ealing. So just to tell you a little bit about Ealing Wildlife Group, and hopefully it illustrates some of the things we can do. Next slide, Ellen, if that's okay. So Ealing Wildlife Group really started by accident when I changed jobs as a vet, and I had a little bit more time on my hands than I had in clinical veterinary life. And I put out kind of a request on a local Facebook group. Would anyone be interested in going on a bat walk this summer in the evening after work? And over 400 people in my neighborhood said yes. So there was enthusiasm there to learn about nature. We've done bat walks for 6 years now. They're really, really good way of engaging all of the community in something unusual in nature. And bats are an indicator species, just like curlews are an indicator species, especially of the intactness of habitats in the urban landscape. Next slide. We've also really fostered a sense of community by getting people involved in hands-on conservation projects. So we have an ethos of 3 C's: community, conservation, and collaboration. So we're not a stuffy naturalist conservation group that, goes out only counting eggs of brown hair streak butterflies on blackthorn and things. We actually really kind of consciously try and come up with projects that will really enthuse people who weren't enthused before about nature. So we sometimes choose kind of iconic or charismatic species to do that. This little guy on the top right there, we put a tank of harvest mice into his hands and asked him to carefully carry them over to our meadow and reintroduce harvest mice back into our kind of rewilded grasslands in Ealing. And that has been one of the most fantastically engaging projects we've done with all kinds of diverse members of our community who don't really have access to green space even. Next slide. Then the other things that we do a photography exhibition, which asks people to get involved and showcase our green spaces. And we've found that that's fostered a sense of ownership of our green spaces and protection. So we can kind of politicize and rally people when they're under threat. And we get involved with all kinds of community events and forest schools, scout groups, and so on. And then finally, we do focus on species that will capture people's imagination. So if we go on to the next slide, I was asked by Ealing Council, because of the work we do with Ealing Wildlife Group, to write their species action plans for their updated biodiversity action plan. So I chose a range of species that would, number one, appeal to the public, but number two, act as umbrella species so that anything we do for them will benefit lots of other wider biodiversity as well. So just a few of our flagship species we work with: peregrine falcons. We just had 3 chicks fledged this last season off Ealing Hospital. Great crested newts are in the borough, and we protect them and do habitat and kind of improvement and enhancement for them. Next slide, I think, if I remember correctly, is bird and mammal. Yeah, barn owls. We've got breeding back in the borough. And that's a 4-year project of changing our grassland management, putting up nest boxes, getting people involved, putting out content all the time to show people these species. We've just launched a hedgehog project. And as Roger said, the next slide will show we're also looking at reintroducing beavers to Ealing. Hopefully later this year. Beavers. Yeah, so harvest mice and beavers are our Rewilding Ealing initiative. Some people, puritanical rewilders, would say that's not true rewilding. You're not doing it at scale, but actually reintroduction of charismatic species and teaching people, especially through beavers, about what beavers can do for climate change, for flood mitigation, for improving biodiversity, and for benefiting people as well as wildlife and green space, has been extremely engaging. So I hope to discuss it a bit more. So that's me.
Sean, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think one of the two things that stand out from what you've just said. One is this idea that no one can be neutral anymore in this game. If you want it, you can't just sit in an armchair. You have to be an activist, and an activist can be just the way you shop, or joining a local group like Sean's, or writing to your MP or something, but you cannot just sit there and expect it to happen. I think the other thing you mentioned with that little lad and the harvest mice is fun. That a lot of us who are in the business, this conservation business, become recorders of decline. And actually what we need to do is get a sense of optimism and positive direction of travel. And there's no one better to take us on, sorry for the hackneyed link, than Joe Wilkins, who is sitting in storm-tossed Aberystwyth. Joe, tell us how things are for you there.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Noswaith dda chi gyd. Yeah, as Roger mentioned, I'm joining from a very stormy West Wales. If there's any Welsh people in the crowd, then you'll know what I mean. It's been a gusty few days, but I haven't got a presentation because I do really want to talk about COP15, and that's perhaps not the most visual of topics to talk about. And Alex and Sean have done such a great job of sort of introducing the issues of biodiversity loss and what we can do there. But I do want to talk about this moment because it was supposed to, and I think in some cases it did, represent a real moment for nature and for biodiversity. And I think, yes, you can get bogged down in, what it didn't achieve, but I do think in our sort of field, it's really important to celebrate the victories that we sometimes get. And the framework isn't perfect by any means, and I'm not going to go through all 23 targets and 4 goals, but there's a lot in there that's good to work with, and we can use that going forward to lobby people, to write to politicians, especially in Westminster, to say, hey, you signed up to this agreement, but you're failing on this, and each of us can apply whatever our specific interests are, whether that's curlews or rivers or oceans in my case, and we can use it as sort of a foundation to campaign on. And I've made a few notes here of stuff that I wanted to mention. There's a mention of rights of nature and rights of Mother Earth in the text of this agreement, which I never thought I would see in a UN document, and it certainly does not relate to the sort of language that they use in the climate, which is extremely corporate. It's extremely numbers based. There's no emotion in it, whereas this is, I think, is as emotional as a United Nations document could get, and it's far more representative of different views and how we connect with the world around us. It's quite hard to connect to gigatons of CO2 per year, but it's quite easy to connect to, your favorite species is declining or your favorite habitat is disappearing. So I do think the framework has a lot of good stuff in it. Yes, it's not perfect, and I think money aspect is probably the single biggest question, because it's all good having this vision and it's all good having these targets, but how do we achieve them? And that really links then into what Sean was talking about, is as individuals, what can we do to follow up on this? And whatever your specific skills are, I think there's a space for you to help implement this. For us at UK for Nature, that's a very policy focused angle. So that means we'll be looking at the lines of the text and taking it forward and saying, Mr. Lord Goldsmith, you were there in Montreal when this was signed, but yet your department is failing on this target. And I think that is a really important thing that we can do. And also, what I say the most important things we as individuals can do is to find our community, which is a strange thing to say, individuals must find community. But I think if you're doing this by yourself, you can suddenly get very overwhelmed, very down, and very, when you're constantly met with something about the river has been dredged without any consideration for the local biodiversity. And it's so important that you have a group that, you can go for a beer for, or you can have a cup of tea with, that you can connect. And that's my biggest advice to anybody, is find a group or an organization or a network, or even just an online group. There's Facebook groups that you can go, and they fill that role of making you feel connected to the world around you. And I think the other thing I like to say is, especially from a youth perspective, but this is for everybody, hopefully more people will now start getting engaged with biodiversity because of COP15, because of a general sort of shift that recognizes the importance of nature. And I do think the pandemic had something to do with that, a little bit of something to do with that. Make sure that you're treating people, it's kind of like as equals. It's not making people feel dumb or they don't know what it's talking about. It's about giving people agency, is the fancy word, but it's basically making people feel listened to and that their advice is being taken on. So when you're engaging with young people, it's really important that the relationship is built on a foundation of trust and equality, that you're sharing knowledge between each other. It's not always the superior, inferior, or the older, younger. It's a relationship built on knowledge sharing, on trust. And I think that is where many organizations fail, is that they kind of take on young people in an advisory role, or not so much an advisory role, that's perhaps the wrong word, in a way that they just want to get young people involved because it might look good. It's not about actually building that relationship to carry on work in the future, to bring in new ideas. Lots of young people have different skills, and I'm talking here about young people, but this applies to all sorts of groups of people who've not been traditionally involved in conservation. And there's a lot of work to be done in how we want conservation to look. And there's a big statement about conservationists. Anyone can be a conservationist, which I do think is really true. There's just a lot of work that needs to be done to get there, rather than it just being anyone's welcome. It's a case of, well, why haven't people been coming in the past, and what can we do to overcome those barriers? And when I'm talking, I like to make a difference between inclusion, which can mean just come along, sit at the table, and participation, which is like come along but get involved. And that's is a key difference. Not saying that one is inclusion is not bad. It's just these terms get thrown and joined together a lot, that I think it's really important that we remember the goal is for everyone to be involved, not just watching. And there's been a couple of great points made that no one can be a bystander anymore. And I think those of us already in this space need to make sure that people feel empowered to not be bystanders, and make it as easy as possible for us to act on what we've been doing and the actions of COP15 to bring it full circle. But I'm going to end there just so we can get going on the discussion. But thank you very much.
Joe, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And actually, it's so much nicer to hear about COP15 from a passionate person who's been there, rather than picking up a report and reading all the bullet points, because that makes it real. And I just found myself wondering whether, when you made your long way back to Aberystwyth, whether you actually, as a young person and someone in the conservation business, whether you felt empowered by what you'd seen and heard.
I think with my job, I've been to a few conferences now. I was at COP26, and I went to Nairobi for the United Nations Environment Conference earlier this year. And I do have to say, COP15 was the only conference I've been to that has left me with a feeling of empowerment and of actual, we can do this. COP26 I left there feeling really, as Sean said, jaded, and left there feeling really overwhelmed, because it was almost so big and had so many vested interests, and there was fossil fuel lobbyists were there as well. Like I didn't leave there feeling very empowered at all. Whereas COP15, yes, it's flawed, yes, it was thing, but I actually left there with a sense of, we might actually do something, and this can give us something to do, which I think in this field is about as good as I can ever review a UN conference, is that I actually did leave with a sense of hope and optimism that hopefully we can all use moving forward this year. So yeah, I did leave feeling empowered, although my flight was delayed by 7 hours on the way back. So that empowerment had to last for a while, a bit longer.
That's great to hear. And actually, let's flip straight over to Alex, who was also there. And as a scientist, Alex, did you leave feeling empowered? Did you have that same feeling because you've been to a lot of these?
I was actually happy. I think there were some criticism about lack of detail and everything else. But at the beginning of COP, we really didn't know whether the countries would agree. And I think having a joint agreement, which is our compass bearing tool really to achieve those targets, and that it's so crucial that we have an agreement on this. So I'm actually I was very pleased to see that we had ambitious targets being set up. Of course, there are all kinds of, the devil is in the details. So I think I did feel empowered, yes. But I'm also quite realistic. So, that's where the job begins. And I think the examples we heard from Sean and Joe, they're just really good examples about what has to be done now, and it involves all of us. So yeah, I feel activated. I want to contribute.
Those two statements alone give cause for hope, because, and I think listening to Sean, that word jaded, which, let's face it, comes up over and over again on these things, and actually to hear the two of you, that gives me hope. Let's just move back to one of the, I sort of mentioned, and we've all mentioned, this idea that climate change has the microphone, and there are 5, 6, 7 other things going on, and they're heavily interrelated and interdependent, but not entirely. So as a curlew charity, we always were very, very much aware that one thing that's very good for climate change, which is planting trees, is not very good for curlews. Maybe with Alex, I was wondering whether to start with you, whether there are other things where you think we have to be careful with those conflicts, whether they turn up in places that we might not think they do.
I think that's a good example where you have, we're trying to tackle one challenge like climate change, and you do that by planting lots of trees. And we've seen some really bad examples in Wales, for instance, and not really understanding what should be there, or using non-native species of trees, and that really can have a very negative effect on biodiversity. So we really have to think about those challenges in a concerted way. And there are really good possibilities of restoring ecosystems in a way that brings back, captures carbon and benefits biodiversity. So that's a really good example, I think. And the other one is about energy production. One of the major challenges, and the UK is importing lots of trees from the US to produce bioenergy, and that's classified as green energy, and that's just absolutely, it's bonkers. So I think we have to find much better ways of making the shift in energy production that is so desperately needed now.
I think one of the things I didn't say about my walk was, I think the thing that consistently annoyed and frustrated me the most was the greenwashing that I became aware of everywhere I looked, and thinking, let's not get on to that because there's lots of other things, but we do need to be very careful, and we need to be very well informed, which is one of the reasons why we do these seminars. Sean, one thing that always strikes me is that we have the best, I think, natural history programs, television programs in the world in this country. But it always strikes me a little strange that we're always looking at lions in the Serengeti, or orcas knocking seals off ice floes in the sub-Antarctic, and penguins. Apart from Spring Watch and Autumn Watch, there's very, very little that happens that features the hedgerow in the middle of your town, or the little pond at the bottom of your garden. Do you feel that? Do you think that that's something where we could improve?
Yeah, I think it's definitely room for improvement, and frustrating for me, having recently done a little bit more kind of TV work and trying to bring the biodiversity message to kind of wider media. You hear, the kind of the pushback on that is, oh, that's been done before. And, the British hedgerow documentary was done in 1987. We did it before, we don't need another one. Well, actually, we've got a new audience now, and we have new messages to tell. And it's okay to repeat the same kind of things, decades later. And I think it comes back to my point on, growth and profit, and being a kind of a capitalist and consumerist and materialist kind of society. There's a nervousness that actually natural history programming needs to get an audience, and it needs to make money. And we've got the formula of showing the global, big, exciting, sexy species that everyone goes, wow, look at that. And there's this reluctance to put the little micro level biodiversity on full screen, or the backyard normal urban wildlife as well, which I've pitched a few times and got knocked back on. Oh, it's not really an audience for that. It's this nervousness that it won't sell, it won't get the audience. We've done it before once, and that's enough. And I think, we need to start thinking, actually, what's natural history programming for? I really, really think it is, I grew up with you know, watching the Attenborough programs and collecting the global wildlife books and reading about the megafauna kind of things. But actually where I got my interest in natural history was the tiny little things that I could see in my back garden and could explore and could observe and learn about. And I think we have to get to the next generation by being really exciting about what they can access. Accessibility is a huge issue, and it's going to become a bigger issue. And if we're all going to try and be more sustainable in our consumption of wildlife and nature, we need to think more on a local level and not be jetting off all over the world to see these things. So we have to enthuse people about what's on their doorstep first. I think that's really, really important.
And I think it's what it also ties back into there's plenty of good news stories out there that we could be covering. I mean, if I go out in my garden, I see 2 or 3 red kites regularly. Well, when I was going out bird watching with my dad as a boy 50 years ago, we would never dream of seeing a red kite. And that stories like that. I mean, maybe Joe, do you have a view on that? What's put on television? Just whether you feel that it's too geared to charismatic fauna elsewhere rather than stuff that's going on right here under our noses.
I think it definitely is. I think, especially, you know, when you're talking sort of BBC Sky level, it's very focused on the, you know, the exotic or the charismatic, or whatever you'd like to call them. But I think there is a difference now because, especially with my generation, you know, you get a lot of your media via Instagram, TikTok, Twitter. There is a bit of a shift, and that's allowing a lot more storytellers to come out. So I think that I'm getting a lot of content based on people's walks and people's hedgerows, because that's the content that they can just make with like their mobile phone. And I think that's not been translated into the, you know, cinematic telly form, but it is popular storytelling. And I think that having different ways to get your documentaries, and I think realizing that Instagram is a useful tool in that respect. So yeah, when it comes to telly, definitely it's over focused on charismatic species elsewhere, but there are other sources of news and media that I think are filling the gap at the moment, at least from my perspective.
I think that's a really good point about how social media has empowered people to do very, very low budget things and to talk about and infuse and get quite a wide listenership. No one reads my tweets, but I did show a picture of the first curlew to be born in Sussex for 200 years. And suddenly my account went off the wall. So you're right, there is reach there. Alex, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I really like what Sean put in his lines about acting locally. You think globally, because it's a major global challenge we're facing today, but we act locally. And I think, in a sense, it is, just as I said, Roger, it's actually fixable. It's a fixable problem. We can do something, and we can change the environment locally so that you get the first curlews breeding. I'm Brazilian from the beginning. I was born and grew up there, and you know, I think that after I'm a scientist as well, so I've written more than 200 scientific papers. Then I realized that I need to do something on the ground that really means something to nature. So my wife and I, we put all the money we had to buy rainforest there. So we had 200 pounds in our account after that. And we are starting a conservation and research center just to increase that thing. So whatever is within our ability, and some people are passionate about birds or plants, you know, it could be any geography, but as long as we do something, we can look at our children or our friends and really, you know, do whatever is possible. Then I think it's really important. And perhaps the TV and, you know, the media is going to be giving some attention to what we're doing. That will be very helpful, because I think people are desperate for good stories and success.
I think that's a good point to leave that one on, which is people are desperate for good stories, and there are good stories out there. And whilst we can't disguise from ourselves what's going on, we can actually say all these things that are being attended to. Let's just maybe look at one other thing before we throw it open to what's going on in the chat. The really, I guess, is one for you, Joe. Schools, and I'm very conscious of we live in the most denatured developed country in the world, as they say, and I don't think any part of it is more denatured than our schools. And I think Mary Colwell's achievement in getting this natural history GCSE back on the thing is massively important, and let's hope that leads to other things up and down. How do you, with such stretched budgets and such rigorous curriculum, how do you actually get out there, UK Youth for Nature, and engage people into this? It seems very hard.
Yeah, that is a big question, because I think, trying to think how the best way to approach this, well, I was very lucky growing up in a rural area that my school had a garden, and we had a local person from the village come in, teach us how to garden. We had a local wildlife area. So in that respect, many rural schools do have some form of connection. I know that's not the same nationwide, and that very much depends also on who's teaching those lessons. Is it just someone who's doing it because they need to tick a box, or is it actually a passion? So it's a very difficult question, and again, it comes back to budget. I think a lot of it's budget for adequate staff. I do think that outdoor experiences have to be prioritized in any form of new curriculum. Wales is exploring a new curriculum that does actually relatively well promote outdoor activities, or at least outdoor learning, because I think it's one thing to learn about something from a book. It's something very different to learn about it on with your hands and on the ground. And if you can get trips to rock pools, that's a much better way to learn about erosion than it is to just watch a video on it. And I think that needs to be prioritized, not just the theory, but the actual experiences. And if you can get those into schools, you've got a captive audience of, well, the whole population, basically, the whole generation is in schools. So if we can build them in, that's what I would like to see prioritized, is outdoor experiences and education about nature coming into as many different aspects of learning as possible. And without going into whole, like, I want to see the whole curriculum changed, I would like to see a more of an element focused on learning, or greater emphasis placed on learning rather than passing exams. And I think that's a balance that needs to be struck in any teaching system, is how much do you value passing exams versus how much do you value actually learning about things. And some of that isn't the most exam. You can't examine me on maybe how the earth felt on my fingers, but that's something I've learned and something I'll take with me forever. So we're really keen on those very practical experiences.
I think we can all say amen to that, and I'm very, very eloquently put. There's loads of stuff coming up in the chat, which I want to give us a chance to talk about. What I would like to do before we do that is quickly ask each of the panelists the one thing that they think could make the biggest difference. And maybe let's start that one with Alex.
I think it's about information, that each one of us try to learn as much as we possibly can on these. And when it comes to kids, for instance, I think, for instance, citizen science projects where you use your mobile phone, because everyone has a smartphone in their pocket. A few years ago in Sweden, I did a project where we had tons of school kids going out and photographing ladybirds, and then using AI to identify the species. So I think using tech could also be a mean of engage them from the first place, but then getting to know the different species rather than just reading lots of books. So I think if we can get at different age levels people to learn more about biodiversity, I think that's the very first step, so that they can find their own niche about what they would like to contribute with. So information.
I mean, just while you're there, it sometimes strikes me that one of the problems is the word biodiversity, that in the old days, I don't know whether we called it nature or what, but when I'm talking, when I'm doing talks and I mention biodiversity, I can sometimes just see shoulders sag, because is there a better way we can describe it? Let's not go there for the time being, but it's a thought. Joe, what would you do?
I think it's about not being afraid to be, I wouldn't say emotional, but I wouldn't, don't be afraid to put an element of personality into what you're talking. I think when you're talking climate change, it's quite nebulous, it's quite like impersonal, whereas when you're talking nature, you can make it really relatable to people, and you can put a face to kind of the problems we're facing around the world. So I don't like to shy away from being kind of personal and emotional when you're talking about nature. You know, everyone has some connection to it somewhere along the line. It might be a hidden memory, but you can bring it out and you can get it out of people. So yeah, don't always just, I'm saying this as a scientist as well, don't always just rely on the science, also bring in that community and that personal connection that people have. And I think that those two together, the science, the connection, will form a really solid basis for action going forward.
I think that point about emotion is a very, very powerful one, and it's not being afraid to show your vulnerability. And I think Sean talked about eco-anxiety and eco-grief. And these are real things. And I remember in the summer, in the autumn, when we were on holiday down in Cornwall, seeing a beach with 7 dead gannets on it from avian flu. And it literally changed my day, changed my week, changed my life, because I'd never up until that point understood the sheer awfulness of it. And no, you're right. Emotion is a very important part. Sean, how about you?
Yeah, it's so hard to pick one. I agree with the guys, but I think it's getting political. You know, I used to see another petition, another plea to write to your MP, and again, sorry to use the jaded line, but okay, how much difference is that going to make? But it's crunch time, and we all make, you know, political decisions every day. We make a political decision 3 times a day with our meal choices and what kind of food we buy and things like that. And I think whatever we do in this society we're in as consumers, let's make right choices if we can, but tell people, tell suppliers, tell policymakers, and kind of talk to your friends and family and work colleagues and things about those political decisions you're making and why. And I think the biggest single thing that we can do is use our votes wisely now and hold governments to account, and write to your local MP and say, I am going to vote next time round on your policy on biodiversity loss and climate and the environment. And politicians want votes. They're in short cycles of power. They want your vote, and if enough of their constituents get onto them, personally writing them an email and saying, I'm going to vote on this single issue and I want you to hold the council to task, I want you to have a policy on this, I want you to make this part of your manifesto, then they're going to hear, actually the tide is turning, people are going to be more demanding on these things. So I think using our political powers is the one thing I would say.
I completely agree with you, and if I can make myself a panelist, which I'm not, but I'm going to for 1 second, I would say the most important thing is almost the way we shop, and you've alluded to it, Sean. And if you read Alex's book, you'll see that I think 50% of biodiversity loss is caused by habitat loss, and 80% of habitat loss is caused by agriculture, which is how we eat. And I think if we can change the way we eat and the way that the freedom that particularly supermarkets feel they have to give us things that are just wrong for the planet, just become a more aggressive, well, not more aggressive, but a trickier shopper. They rely on us not being tricky shoppers. Guys, that was fantastic. We have now got half an hour and there's lots of stuff coming up in the chat. So Ellen, can I bring you back in? What would you like us to talk about?
Yes, yeah. So there's lots of really interesting stuff going on in the chat. And I'm going to start off with a question that's come up a couple of times, and it's something that both Alex and Joe alluded to with COP15. So generally, the feeling with COP15 was that it's quite positive. We've obviously got this global biodiversity framework, but that's kind of the start. What happens next? How do we translate that into UK law and actually make that change stuff within the UK?
Right, so let's have Alex off on that one.
Well, it's a really good question, and it's not really up to me to decide. We're having a workshop next week. We're inviting some politicians to Kew as well. So we do have good contacts with, for instance, with Lord Goldsmith and some others. So it's really up to the UK government now to interpret how this is going to be translated into legislation. And I think that's really the critical part, because the global biodiversity framework is actually not legally binding. So, if countries don't want to do them, we can't really hold them accountable. So I think the critical part now is really to implement those things into the legislation so they can actually get implemented. And there are all sorts of questions when it comes to the metrics. I saw someone else was asking about this as well. So I think, I don't have the answer. It's not my job, but I really think that they have to crack it now because we're short of time basically.
And Sean?
Yeah, again, I think it comes back to telling your local politicians that this is the issue that you care about most and you want to see action on it, because there has been a sense of all words and no action. So I think it's just applying the political pressure you have as a voter and as a person with a little bit of impact to try and apply the pressure, and just spreading the message and talking about it in day-to-day conversations with people that this is important. And a lot of people just don't know or just aren't interested, and when you start to talk to them about it enthusiastically and, as Joe said, with emotion, they will come on board. The more we speak about it in positive and optimistic ways, the more people will go, yeah, look, this is important. I care about it too.
And I think one of the issues in politics is we sort of tend to limit our idea of politicians as MPs. Actually, there are politicians, district councils and county councils, and who have a huge effect. If you can persuade your district council to stop mowing the sides of the verges, and actually they're very happy to do it now because they've discovered it saves them money. But things like that, and it's a lot easier, I've found, as a parish councillor, getting stuff like that done. Yes, the national politicians have the power, but there's a lot that you can do other than that. Joe, anything from you on that?
No, I was going to kind of mention what you sort of did about broadening our idea of what a politician can be, and also what we do at UK for Nature is also map out the non-elected officials, the sort of the civil servants who are actually implementing a lot of this. Like, that's a whole process. What I also wanted to say was there is obviously legislation in place and this is across the UK because environment is often devolved. So the Senedd controls a lot of environment stuff in Wales. There are environment acts and environment bills and water quality. There's a whole raft of different legislation, but it's obviously not accomplishing what it needs to do. And quite often politicians will say, oh, we don't need to do anything because the Environment Act exists. But the Environment Act is not covering what it needs to, obviously, because we're still experiencing decline. So what I'm hoping with the process of kind of implementing COP15 and the framework is we as NGOs and people need to realize what the gaps in the policy that this could potentially fill, because their automatic response is, this exists, we don't need to do anything, but it's not working. So we need to think smartly and cleverly what we ask for when we talk about implementation.
Brilliant. Right, Ellen, throw another one at us.
So this is kind of, I guess, following on from that. A couple of people have asked about companies and businesses and viewing nature as a stakeholder. And I think you guys have talked about how people sort of understand climate change issues more and they're talked about more. And there's obviously this whole concept of carbon credits, which is relatively familiar to people. But there are, I think, biodiversity credits as well. But I just wonder if you guys want to talk about how companies can get involved with protecting nature and how we can be pushing companies to be protecting nature.
I'm going to throw my tuppence worth in at the start, which is that I think that such is the obsession with climate change that companies tend to look at climate change as the only show in town. And you're absolutely right. There needs to be a way we can move on from that, because the activities of companies, just like our own activities, affect biodiversity. Sean, have a go at that one.
Yeah, so I mean, we do it on a local level with kind of some local businesses and corporations where we offer them their kind of corporate away day as part of their CSR policy, corporate social responsibility, and would say to them that, there is lots of greenwashing going on, but here's something that you can do instead of, buying up some tree planting in Scotland and saying to your employees, tick, we've done that for you. Actually get your employees out and have some fun education on the ground in their local community, doing something good for nature. And I think it's those kind of outreach opportunities to local businesses that you can really kind of drive future relationships as well, and then go back to those businesses having given them a fun away day, and say, hey, now we've got a Swift project, would you like to sponsor some Swift boxes? Or you're a developer, would you like to put some Swift boxes up on your next high-rise tower of flats, things like that. So I think it's kind of trying to get on a local level, micro level maybe, get businesses involved and really kind of sell them the kind of benefits of engaging with biodiversity improvements and green space improvements on a local level, rather than just the kind of greenwashing schemes that a lot of them are out there, you know.
I think that's a great point, and shameless plug for one of Colio Action's corporate partners, Hebtroco, which is the company that put the trouser back into Hebden Bridge. One of their idea of a corporate away day was to get a load of sphagnum plugs and go out and repopulate a peat bog up in the Pennines. And I just think that that was such a lovely thing to do, because it's not just for today, it's for tomorrow and forever, because that's how you restore them. Alex, anything on that?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of things to discuss. I mean, it's a really good, really important aspect, and I think I agree, you know, what was said in terms of the politicians, but I think companies have a huge ability of moving much faster sometimes and making an impact. I think the risk of greenwashing is overwhelming, and it's not very easy to spot greenwashing. So I think one issue that I have troubles with is the concept of net. So net neutral, you know, net positive. I'll paste a link here about the problem of nature positive. You know, we come up with those buzzwords, and then at COP15 was very interesting to see, especially the youth, really not keen on hearing that anymore, because they think that this is just about, okay, let's keep business as usual, just put some money to reforestation somewhere. So I really think you have to report your environmental impact, and that's carbon emissions, and that's destruction of nature, you know, land area, whatever metrics you use, and then you can report in your investments on nature, like restoration or conservation. That's fine. So if you have report those two, but you cannot just pretend that they don't exist because you've done an offsetting. So, but again, I think that there are some companies that are very serious in trying to do the right thing, but I think we need to work with them so that we really see positive effects, which are real and really mean a reduction in the destruction that we're seeing today.
I think I'd throw in having political fund, having taxpayer funding of political parties as my little controversial one on that one. So that anyway, let's not go there. Joe, anything to add on that one? There's some quite interesting ones coming up on the thread, actually.
Not much to add. Personally, maybe controversially, I dislike the concept of biodiversity credits because I don't think, especially in the mindset of how it applies to carbon credits, you know, it's like offsetting net gain, and kind of like Alex was saying, it kind of suggests that nature can reach, like, it's okay if we lose some here because you've offset it and gained some here, which is just not how nature works, because each part of nature, you know, has its links to another part of nature, and it goes back to right back to the beginning, the quote you said about if you pull up the John Muir quote, if you pull up one thing, you'll find it's connected to everything else. So I have serious concerns and issues about biodiversity credits as a concept. I liked what sort of Sean was mentioning about when it comes to corporations, working with them to change mindsets and change behaviors. And so it's not so much an offset, but it's a learning opportunity and a moving forward opportunity. But yeah, I have very serious concerns about offsetting when it comes to biodiversity, because I just don't think it's possible. And I think we've seen that with projects such as HS2, where there's been a lot of talk of biodiversity net gain, and there might be more species there because before they were ancient oak woodlands, but now they've planted 4 new species of tree that weren't there before. And so I think once you get into credits and offsetting, it's a slippery slope to, you know, greenwashing and nature washing, or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, that's my soapbox moment of nature is not sort of transferable and not the same as when you talk about carbon emissions.
It's a good soapbox moment, and I rather enjoyed the idea that Formula One is going to be carbon neutral by 2030 as a kind of example of, if you've got a good PR department, you can make anything look good. Ellen, what are we going to talk about next? We've probably got time for a couple more.
Yeah, there are so many questions in the chat. So I'm going to ask a question about education first, and then I'm going to go on to 30 by 30 targets. So lots of people were talking about the importance of education in schools, and were wondering what kinds of stuff we should be teaching our kids to engage them with nature. And then the other side of the education is, a few people have raised the point that environmental politics is pretty inaccessible unless you're interested in reading policy documents, and they are very, very boring. So how can we make environmental politics more accessible and engaging so that more people back them, and then more people are putting pressure on our governments?
Right.
That's quite a big question, sorry.
Who'd like to kick off with that one? I'm sensing Sean might.
I'll kick off with the engaging kids one, I guess, is that I got my love of nature from the wonder moments, you know, that sense of wonder of discovering something. And a lot of the time as a kid, you know, your world is in micro, and you're, you know, low to the ground, and you're looking at small things all the time. But I think the first thing that you need to do is, like Joe said, you know, not teaching them, like, you know, what is ecology on a basic level from a textbook, is bringing them out and showing them something that they're going to go, wow. And we've had so many great moments with kind of things we've done with Ealing Wildlife Group, whether it's scouts on a bat walk, or family friendly, you know, create some reptile habitat days with us, and showing kids their very first slow worm or common newt under a felt mat and things like that. Those little moments, I think, are like the building blocks for the future conservationists. And it seems like a cliche to say that, but actually giving kids that moment of wonder of how like fascinating nature is, and how amazing it is up close. I think that's the first thing you have to do. The bigger question, I think, a very, very difficult one to say, how do you transform environmental policy into something that's appealing and interesting to the masses? I don't think we can. I think it's just, I think maybe it's ambitious, but I think there needs to be a kind of systemic change on what governments are measuring against. And it can't continue to be this GDP and growth and business as usual at all costs. And I think actually, again, politicizing ourselves and things, we just have to put pressure on to say not everyone's going to be interested in getting involved or campaigning or lobbying, but the people who are actually need to lobby the right things. And I think that's the kind of shift in the system to measure ecological integrity as just as valuable as GDP, you know?
I think that's a really good point. And actually we've mentioned growth in GDP 2 or 3 times. That one of the things that really shocked me, and I'm sure it did all you watching in the Conservative leadership campaign in the summer, was all that was talked about was growth and growth and growth. And what wasn't talked about was any of this stuff. And at some point you thought someone's going to tap these guys on the shoulder and go, isn't it a good idea to, and it was really scary that not only did they not talk about it, but no one felt it was important that they did. And, you know, it's growth that's got us here, or it's the search for unreasonable growth. Alex, anything more on that one?
Well, I'll just recommend people to read the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. I think one of the things, you know, you're just saying in terms of growth, the reason why we've had growth is exactly because it removed the natural capital. So it's a very false sense of growth because we're taking from somewhere and we're not giving nature the time to restore itself. So, you know, it's we absolutely have to change our mindset. And I think countries like New Zealand, Bhutan, Ecuador, they are already discussing, you know, more inclusive ways of well-being and what's the target, what's the goal for a country? Is it just to grow its economy, or is it that its people have a good life? And I think we have to think much more holistically in terms of national priorities. And when it comes to engagement of kids, I would say exposure. I think, you know, it's been cited, but just drag kids along, just expose us and them. I think that's really the best sense, because then they can discover something by themselves. And that's a much different thing than just teaching them something. I think they need to experience themselves. We're all animals, so we interact with nature in a way that we can't do through a book or a screen like tonight.
That's great. And Joe? You don't have to have a separate view on this if you.
No, I think when it comes to the making politics accessible and even maybe attractive to people, it's about, you know, we're often sold that when you watch the news or when you watch what you're taught in school, it's very individual action focused in the sort of, you know, what can you buy, what do you wear, which is crucial, and I'm not trying to dismiss it, but I think it's about when we have conversations realizing that there are bigger issues at play within society, and that kind of leads you then to policy, because like me buying, you know, being vegetarian, only eating so much meat or whatever can only do so much. But if the policy around the food that is available, the food that is sold changes, that's a bigger change again. So I think getting people realizing the importance of individuals, but going back to you're part of a system, you are kind of trapped within this system. So making that realize, and I also think that will help tackle some of the anxiety that people feel, because they're like, I'm not doing enough, but you know, living here in mid Wales, public transport isn't the most accessible. It's expensive, or so I should be getting the bus. But if I had to get the bus, I'd be waiting 2 hours when I need to get somewhere. So it's making people realize and connecting the dots that there's a bigger systemic issue, and then that's when you really get into policy and, you know, make it as glamorous as you want, do some cool videos, all that sort of helps. I think policy is quite dense, so if you're an expert on it, you know, make something funny, make something humorous, or sarcasm, satire, it always goes well. Like anything like that, you know, that does really well with people. So yeah, if you're an expert or you know what you're talking about, talk to people in a way that makes it accessible, and don't try to sound smart for the sake of sounding smart sometimes.
Good point. Right, Ellen, let's do one more meaty one.
Ooh, a meaty one. Okay, well, I did say before that I was going to ask about 30 by 30, and I think it's probably good if somebody just briefly explains what 30 by 30 is. But do we think 30 by 30 is enough? Should we be excited about this? And how likely is it that we're going to hit those targets?
Alex, I think you're the man to explain what 30 by 30 is.
Yeah, I love that target. I mean, it's not enough, but it's a first step. I think the scientific evidence shows that perhaps we need 50% of the planet to, you know, protect 80% of all species. But let's start with 30%. But there, and it's great. It's about oceans and about terrestrial land, that we need to protect 30% of the surface of the planet until 2030. So it's a very short timeline. It's also about the different ecosystems. So it should be biologically meaningful areas. There are some issues though, and one of them is about choosing which areas to protect. We've seen from evidence of you know, different sources of research that if just target is, if the total area is the target, then people would just buy the cheapest land, the least valuable, rather than protecting the land which is most important for biodiversity, you know, close to cities, for instance. And it's also about effectiveness, because there are a lot of places on this planet which are classified as nature reserves. You go to Africa, but they're just on the paper. So you invest in effectiveness, which in turn means working with the local communities so that they really can support conservation and protection and sustainable management. It's about a rights-based approach. It's not about land grabbing. It's about working with the communities, you know, because that's going to be very beneficial for them. It's about using the right sort of data. There are 8 times more, I'm sorry, Roger, there are 8 times more key biodiversity areas selected on the basis of birds than on plants. And that's fine, but I think we need to think holistically. What are the different elements that constitute an ecosystem? And so there are issues. I could go on for a while, but I think overall it's a good target. Are we going to achieve it? I think that people have no idea how much it's going to cost. That's one of the reasons why I'm glad that the agreement was achieved, but it wasn't the presidents, it wasn't the prime ministers who were there. And I think people are going to wake up and realize that it's going to be really, really expensive. And therefore, I think that ourselves, individuals, but also companies will have to contribute so that we voluntarily protect land and not only wait for the government to do that for us. So it's something that we all can do.
Brilliant. Sean, anything to add on 30 by 30? In fact, no, let's ask Joe, because Joe was there. You have strong 30 by 30 thoughts.
Yeah, I do. 30 by 30. I think the important thing to realize is that the 30 by 30 campaign and ask, the messaging around it has become a bit clouded. Speaking to people who've been involved in the campaign since the beginning, asking for this target, it was always a stepping stone. It was always, sort of framed in the at least 30% by 2030, not we need to aim for 30 and that's it. So I think that's really important to put out there. We now have the target from Montreal, which is 30 by 30. And so, like Alex said, it's not the goal. It's kind of like the minimum of where we need to be. But obviously how we achieve that. And I think lots of people have raised it, the importance of bringing this international agreement into a nationally relevant context, because what protection in the UK will look very different to protection in Ecuador, for example, because of the way our ecosystems have changed, and we've industrialized 200, 300 years ago, and we don't have many wild spaces as we think of them, but we still need to protect what we have. So it'll look different. And again, back to Alex's point, it's also about the sea, and I'm a big ocean lover, and I think you kind of raised the point earlier about where climate change and biodiversity sometimes disagree. And when you're discussing about the high seas, the areas that no one controls, there's a lot of talk around deep sea mining being justified to create new renewable technology, and that threatens everything. And this is an interesting example where one UK department is saying we need to protect 30 by 30, but another UK department is supporting a weapons company to start developing deep sea mining in the Pacific. So you've got on one side them saying good things, and on the other side saying bad things. So that's a ramble and a little thing, but 30 by 30 I think is a good start. And now it's the question of implementation within the UK that is the really important question.
And actually, in the middle of that, you raised another really good point about how sometimes you do something for the greater good and there is damage elsewhere, like a black guillemot swims into your tidal turbine, but the tidal turbine is doing good. And I think my feeling is we just need to be more grown up about having those discussions, and no one's done anything wrong. It's just people are trying to sort it, and there's going to be collateral damage on the way, and we need to have a view about it. Sean, 30. Anything else on that one?
I think on a UK level, an Irish level, I guess like the rewilding movement or argument kind of illustrates that quite well in terms of competing interests and landowners, massive wealthy landowners owning the majority of land in Scotland, for example, a very small number of wealthy landowners, the kind of competing interests of grouse moors, farmers, conservationists. It kind of illustrates it on a very local level. How will we get global agreement on committing to these things? And I think one of the problems really is getting that kind of tipping point of governments to say, yeah, we'll sign up, because there's almost this, dare I say, fear of missing out, or fear of losing out if you commit too much before everyone else does. Will it affect your competition in the world? Will it affect your political power in the world if you're affecting that bottom line, as it were? So I think it's a difficult one. Again, not to be pessimistic, we're told all the time to be climate and nature optimistic. I think it just has to reach this tipping point that we keep applying the pressure. These COP kind of conferences keep applying the pressure and getting people to commit. And once we get that tipping point where everyone's committing, it's almost like fear of missing out, of being the odd one out and not committing as well. So just keeping up that pressure. And as you said, Roger, having adult conversations. The thing I hate in this entire sphere of conservation versus rewilding, which should be on the same side in many ways, is it's all black and white thinking. It's like, if you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not on my side and my philosophy, then you're my enemy, and I'm going to disagree with everything you say because I don't want to hear it. So we just need to get better, all stakeholders. Even if we don't agree with what the others are doing, we need to get better at talking and having dialogue, and realizing that no matter your interests, niche interests or otherwise, we're all under pressure here. We're all under threat here. We have to start talking and have to start collaborating better and having adult conversations about the difficult topics.
And I think the opinion formers at the top need to lead on that one. And I think saying something that's headline grabbing and gets a few likes sometimes isn't very useful. I think, oddly enough, the other thing you were talking about land ownership, and when I was sort of researching for the book of my walk, the law of unintended consequences strikes there and strikes all the time. That in Scotland, where you were heading towards a lot of community ownerships, and that's a good thing. Not anymore, you won't, because the green gold has raised the price of land, as far as I know, in the Highlands by about a factor of 2, and suddenly what was accessible no longer is. So I think all these things, we just need to look at them holistically. And do we have time? We do. We have time for one more question. And I think Ellen's got something she really wants to throw at us.
Oh, I was just looking through and I was wondering, if you asked me that, which one would I pick? Because there are so many. There's a quite meaty one that would touch on elms. And obviously, no? Okay.
I'd avoid the meaty one.
Okay, sorry. That would have been a great discussion. I should have asked it earlier. So I saw a really good one from Annabelle Ross, who said, if you could get in a room with one person who would be able to make a difference on biodiversity globally and in the UK, who would it be for each speaker?
Let's start with Sean.
Can we start with someone else and have a think?
Okay, we'll start with, I think Joe is smiling. Let's start with Joe.
It's not smiling for good reason. It's smiling because I'm trying to rack my brain about the one person.
All right, Alex. Oh, Alex, have you got there yet?
No, sorry, it's a really hard one. I wish, no, it's going to be very political. But
Okay, I've found one. It's hard. Maybe, the head of education, Minister for Education, and just really start at the bottom of the funnel, as it were. Try and get, Mary's done a brilliant job with the GCSE, but I think actually weaving in biodiversity and nature appreciation into every curriculum of a child's education is the way, because we're all on the way out. If we think about, the timeline we're on and the blink of an eye difference that we're going to make in our lifetimes, I think most of us here are probably approaching a third or halfway through our lifetime. Actually, let's start at the bottom layer and get kids enthused about it and get them educated and optimistic about what difference they can make in their lifetime. So I think, if we needed one person, it's the Minister for Education to try and make that change.
Right, Joe, you're smiling now. You've got a calm smile, like you've thought about this.
Yeah, Sean triggered something in my mind, and I vary from a Wales specific context, but I think discussing it with the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales is actually a very important step that links to what Sean was saying about, keeping the future and keeping, progress going. Just because in Wales, every piece of legislation and policy has to go through their office to check on its sustainability, on how it's securing the rights of future generations. So I think they're a great place to start, because they're not part of the government or the Senate, and they can still influence the policy that is taking place. So I think in Wales they're a very important player to target.
And I'm going to give Alex about 30 more seconds of time to think about it by saying mine would be Rishi Sunak, because he is the Prime Minister, he has the purse strings, he was the Chancellor, and if it doesn't come from him, it's not going to come from anyone. Right, Alex, close it up.
Just a bit different. I think I would sit down with Elon Musk. He's one of the few billionaires who's not giving away that much. Instead of buying Twitter, he could have protected half of the Amazon. So I think we need a lot of cash flow. We need money on the table. We need a lot of the underdeveloped countries, which have been struggling for centuries, and the systemic imbalance that we have across the world. And I think we need to see support and real financial support to make that happen, because otherwise it won't.
That is a great place to end. And one of the things we're very careful to do on these seminars is not let them drag on through the evening. And I think there's a lot of people who would love this discussion to go on, but let's take the discussion elsewhere to the people who perhaps aren't as engaged as the people here. First of all, thank you so much to the panelists who we are really lucky to have. And actually, I didn't realize an hour and a half ago quite how lucky we were to have them, because it's worked so well, and the feeding off and all these ideas. I don't want to summarize what we've talked about, other than to say, I think the answer is get active, get informed, get involved, and get political. We've got to do this. This really, really matters. And I think it's all of us on this webinar taking out to our friends and relations and our, the people in our lives that this really matters. Thank you to Ellen for keeping us in order. And thank you above all to you guys spending your Wednesday evening with us. Our next one is, Ellen, when is our next one?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot.
Okay, well, we go on the Code Action website and you'll see our next one. But thank you so much, everyone. I found that a completely inspiring discussion. There's lots of stuff we didn't talk about, but go well, keep safe, and I hope it doesn't rain quite as much tomorrow as it did today. Thank you.
Next one, sorry, I've just had a look. Next one is cost of a curlew, so environmental economics. It's going to be another really, really interesting one. I'll put the link in the chat. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Have a nice evening.